In the heart of the unforgiving Wild West, where the sun beat down relentlessly and the wind carried whispers of forgotten dreams, lay the town of Dust Gulch. It was a place carved from hardship, a testament to the resilience and sometimes the cruelty of those who dare to call a home. Here, in a cluster of sun-baked buildings huddled against the vast expanse of the desert, lived Sarah. Sarah wasn't like the other women in Dust Gulch. While they busied themselves with the traditional tasks of homemaking, Sarah spent her days wandering the arid landscape, collecting herbs, and studying the natural world. She possessed an uncanny knowledge of plants and their healing properties, a skill passed down from her grandmother, who was rumored to have been a medicine woman. This knowledge made her both respected and feared in equal measure. Some whispered that she had a connection to the unseen world, a touch of the mystical that set her apart. She lived on the outskirts of town, in a small, weathered cabin surrounded by a garden of her own making. Within this space, vibrant wildflowers bloomed in defiance of the harsh environment, a testament to Sarah's nurturing touch. She often helped the townsfolk with their ailments, brewing teas and concocting remedies that seemed to work wonders. But in a town steeped in superstition, her skills were often viewed with suspicion. The townsfolk of Dust Gulch were a hardy bunch, weathered by the elements and hardened by the constant struggle for survival. They clung to their beliefs, their faith, and their traditions, finding solace in a world that offered little comfort. But beneath their rough exteriors lay a deep-seated fear of the unknown, a fear that could easily be manipulated. And in those desperate times, fear could be a dangerous thing, turning neighbor against neighbor and leading to accusations and judgments based on little more than whispers and conjecture. Dust Gulch wasn't just any Wild West town. It was a crucible of hardship, a place where survival demanded unwavering grit and a healthy dose of luck. The sun, a relentless tyrant, baked the earth to a cracked, dusty brown. Water was scarce, a precious commodity fought over and guarded jealously. The wind, an ever-present companion, howled through the narrow streets, carrying with it sand, dust, and the mournful cries of coyotes in the distance. Buildings were constructed of rough-hewn timber and sun-dried bricks, their facades weathered and faded by years of exposure to the elements. The saloon, the Golden Nugget, stood as the town's most prominent structure, its swinging doors a constant invitation to weary travelers and desperate souls. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, the clinking of glasses, and the murmur of conversations that often devolved into drunken brawls. Beyond the saloon, a general store offered a meager selection of supplies at exorbitant prices. A blacksmith hammered tirelessly at his forge, shaping metal into tools and weapons. A small church, its white paint peeling under the scorching sun, stood as a testament to the town's enduring faith. The people of Dust Gulch were a reflection of their environment, tough, resilient, and wary. They were farmers and ranchers, miners and merchants, outlaws and lawmen, all drawn to this desolate corner of the world by the promise of opportunity or the need for escape. They faced constant challenges: drought, disease, Indian raids, and the ever-present threat of bandits. Lately, Dust Gulch had been plagued by a string of misfortunes. The already scarce rainfall had dwindled to almost nothing, crops withered in the fields, and cattle sickened and died. A mysterious illness swept through the town, leaving many bedridden and weak. The townsfolk grew increasingly desperate, their hopes slowly replaced by fear and despair. It was in this climate of hardship and uncertainty that Sarah's unusual knowledge would become a focal point of suspicion and dread. The very skills that once earned her respect were now viewed with a growing sense of unease, as the town searched for someone to blame for their collective misfortune. The misfortunes continued to pile up, each one fueling the growing unease in Dust Gulch. Farmer Giles's prize bull, usually a picture of robust health, was found dead in its pen, inexplicably drained of blood. Martha's chickens, her sole source of income, stopped laying eggs, their feathers ruffled and dull. Little Timmy, the blacksmith's son, fell ill with a fever that burned hotter than the forge, leaving him delirious and weak. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern, a dark cloud that seemed to be settling over the town. The townsfolk whispered amongst themselves, their voices hushed with fear. They spoke of curses, of dark magic, of forces beyond their understanding. Old wives' tales, long forgotten in more prosperous times, resurfaced, gaining new credence in the face of their mounting troubles. It started subtly, a sideways glance here, a hushed conversation there. But soon, the whispers began to coalesce into accusations. Sarah's name was on everyone's lips. Her knowledge of herbs, once seen as a blessing, was now viewed as a sign of something sinister. Her solitary habits, her preference for the company of plants over people, were interpreted as evidence of a connection to the dark arts. "She's different," they muttered. "She knows too much." Some recalled her grandmother, the medicine woman, and the rumors that had always swirled around her. Whispers of pacts with spirits and rituals performed under the light of the full moon. Could Sarah have inherited her grandmother's dark gifts? The fear was palpable, a thick, suffocating blanket that stifled reason and fueled suspicion. People who had once sought Sarah's help now avoided her, crossing the street to avoid her gaze. Doors slammed shut as she approached, and children were warned to stay away from her cabin. The seeds of doubt had been sown, and they were beginning to sprout, poisoning the minds of the townsfolk and turning them against the woman who had once been their healer. The stage was set for a full-blown accusation, a desperate attempt to find a scapegoat for their woes. Reverend Elijah arrived in Dust Gulch during a particularly dry spell, his booming voice and fiery sermons filling the void left by the previous, more mild-mannered preacher. He was a man of imposing stature, with a stern face and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through you. He spoke with unwavering conviction, quoting scripture with ease and condemning sin with righteous fury. At first, the townsfolk welcomed him, drawn to his charismatic preaching and his promises of salvation. But Reverend Elijah was not merely interested in saving souls. He was also hungry for power. He saw the fear and desperation in Dust Gulch as an opportunity to solidify his influence, to become the moral compass and undisputed leader of the community. He seized upon the growing suspicion surrounding Sarah, skillfully manipulating the townsfolk's fear and ignorance. He preached sermons about the dangers of witchcraft, warning against those who consorted with dark forces and tempting souls away from God. He twisted scripture to fit his narrative, portraying Sarah as a serpent in the garden, a threat to the town's very survival. "These are signs, my brothers and sisters," he thundered from the pulpit. "Signs of God's displeasure. We must root out the evil that festers among us, lest we all be consumed by its flames." He pointedly mentioned Sarah's knowledge of herbs, subtly suggesting that it was not a gift from God, but a tool of the devil. He reminded them of her grandmother, the medicine woman, and the dark rumors that had followed her. He stoked the flames of fear, turning suspicion into outright condemnation. His words had a profound effect on the townsfolk, who were already vulnerable and desperate for answers. They saw Reverend Elijah as a strong and righteous leader, a man who could guide them through these dark times. They clung to his words, blindly accepting his pronouncements as gospel. With each sermon, the noose tightened around Sarah's neck, as Reverend Elijah skillfully orchestrated her downfall, solidifying his power base in the process. He transformed her from an eccentric healer into a scapegoat for the town's suffering. The trial of Sarah was a mockery of justice, a grim spectacle fueled by fear and prejudice. It was held in the town square, under the scorching sun, a symbolic setting that underscored the town's collective judgment. Reverend Elijah presided over the proceedings, his presence lending an air of legitimacy to the sham. There was no real evidence presented against Sarah, only whispers and accusations. Martha claimed that Sarah had cursed her chickens, causing them to stop laying eggs. Farmer Giles testified that his bull had died after Sarah had passed by his pen. Little Timmy's mother sobbed as she recounted her son's illness, blaming Sarah for casting a spell on him. Each accusation was met with nods of agreement from the crowd, their faces contorted with anger and fear. Sarah stood accused, her hands bound, her eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and despair. She tried to defend herself, to explain her knowledge of herbs, and to deny the accusations leveled against her. But her words were drowned out by the chorus of condemnation. "I have helped you all," she cried, her voice cracking with emotion. "I have healed your sick, eased your pain. How can you believe these lies?" But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The townsfolk were too consumed by fear, too eager to find a scapegoat for their troubles. They wanted to believe in Sarah's guilt. It gave them a sense of control, a way to make sense of the chaos that had engulfed their lives. Reverend Elijah skillfully manipulated the proceedings, guiding the townsfolk towards the inevitable verdict. He reminded them of their duty to God, their responsibility to protect their community from evil. He portrayed Sarah as a threat to their very souls, a dangerous force that needed to be eradicated. The trial was a foregone conclusion. The deck was stacked against Sarah from the start. The townsfolk, whipped into a frenzy by fear and Reverend Elijah's rhetoric, were determined to find her guilty, regardless of the evidence. Justice had no place in Dust Gulch that day. Only fear and vengeance reigned supreme. The verdict was swift and merciless, guilty of witchcraft. The sentence, death by hanging. Jedediah, the town's hangman, was a man of few words and a somber demeanor. His job was a grim necessity in a town like Dust Gulch, a place where justice was often swift and unforgiving. He was a large man, with calloused hands and a weathered face that spoke of years spent under the harsh desert sun. His eyes, though, held a surprising depth, a hint of the humanity that lay beneath his stoic exterior. He wasn't a cruel man, not by nature. He saw his job as a duty, a necessary evil that kept order in a lawless land. He carried out his tasks with a quiet professionalism, never reveling in the suffering of others. But the weight of his responsibility bore heavily on his soul. Each life he took left an indelible mark, a shadow that lingered in his thoughts. He had witnessed many executions in his time, each one a tragic reminder of the darker side of human nature. He had seen hardened criminals face their fate with stoicism or defiance, and he had seen innocent men tremble with fear and beg for mercy. But something about Sarah's case was different. From the moment he heard the accusations against her, he felt a sense of unease. He had observed the trial, listened to the flimsy evidence, and witnessed the town's descent into hysteria. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that Sarah was being unjustly condemned. He saw the fear in her eyes, the genuine bewilderment at the accusations leveled against her. He noticed the kindness she showed to the jailer, offering him a soothing balm for his aching back. He heard her whisper prayers at night, not the incantations of a witch, but the heartfelt pleas of a woman seeking solace from God. As he prepared the gallows for Sarah's execution, Jedediah's conscience weighed heavily on him. He wrestled with his duty, his sense of justice, and a nagging feeling that he was about to participate in a terrible wrong. The closer the execution drew, the more conflicted he became. He knew that defying the town would mean risking his own life, but the thought of hanging an innocent woman was becoming unbearable. The day of the hanging dawned hot and unforgiving, the sun beating down on Dust Gulch with relentless intensity. A large crowd had gathered in the town square, their faces a mixture of anticipation and grim satisfaction. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the occasional cough or murmur. Sarah was led from the jail, her hands bound, her face pale but resolute. She walked with a quiet dignity, refusing to show any sign of fear. Jedediah watched her closely, his heart aching with pity and doubt. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw a strength and resilience that defied the accusations leveled against her. As she stood on the gallows, the noose dangling ominously above her head, Sarah looked out at the crowd, her gaze sweeping across their faces. She saw hatred, fear, and a disturbing sense of righteousness. But she also saw a flicker of doubt in some eyes, a hint of the humanity that still lingered beneath the surface. "I am innocent," she declared, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the square. "I have done nothing to harm this town. I have only tried to help." Her words hung in the air, momentarily silencing the crowd. Some shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting away from her gaze. But Reverend Elijah stepped forward, his face contorted with anger. "Silence this witch," he roared, his voice filled with righteous indignation. "She seeks to deceive you with her lies. Do not listen to her. She is a servant of the devil." His words reignited the crowd's anger, drowning out Sarah's pleas for justice. The murmur of the crowd grew louder, more menacing. Jedediah felt a surge of anger towards Reverend Elijah, a growing conviction that he was manipulating the town for his own selfish gain. He looked at Sarah, her eyes pleading with him to believe her. He looked at the crowd, their faces twisted with hatred and fear. He looked at the noose, the symbol of his grim duty, and he knew that he could no longer remain silent. He had to make a choice, a decision that would determine Sarah's fate and his own. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, the responsibility almost unbearable. The time for action had come. In the days leading up to the execution, Jedediah found himself unable to shake off the feeling that he was making a terrible mistake. He visited Sarah in her cell, bringing her food and water, engaging her in quiet conversation. He tried to discern any hint of malice or darkness in her demeanor, but he found none. He learned about her love for nature, her passion for healing, and her deep sense of empathy for others. She spoke of her dreams for Dust Gulch, her vision of a town where knowledge and understanding replaced fear and superstition. He saw a woman who was not only innocent, but also a valuable asset to the community. He also observed the way the townsfolk treated her. They spat on her cell, hurled insults, and threatened her with violence. He saw the hatred in their eyes, the blind rage that had consumed them. He realized that they were not seeking justice. They were seeking a release for their own pent-up frustrations and fears. One evening, as he sat with Sarah in her cell, he noticed a small, intricately carved wooden amulet hanging around her neck. It was a symbol he recognized from his own childhood, a symbol of protection and healing passed down through generations of his family. He had almost forgotten about it, but seeing it on Sarah's neck triggered a memory, a long-dormant connection to his own past. He asked her about the amulet, and she explained that it had been given to her by her grandmother, who had taught her the secrets of herbs and healing. She said that it was a symbol of hope and resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always light to be found. As he listened to her speak, Jedediah felt a profound sense of recognition, a feeling that he was connected to Sarah in some way. He realized that he could not stand by and allow her to be unjustly condemned. He had to find a way to save her, even if it meant risking everything he held dear. The weight of his decision settled upon him, heavy but resolute. He knew what he had to do. He just needed to find the right moment. As Sarah stood on the gallows, ready to face her unjust fate, Jedediah noticed something in the crowd. A nervous twitch in the eye of Old Man Withers, the town's usually stoic banker. Withers was known for his tight-fisted grip on the town's finances and his unwavering support of Reverend Elijah. But now, he seemed uneasy, his gaze darting nervously between Sarah and the preacher. Jedediah remembered a conversation he'd overheard between Withers and Reverend Elijah a few weeks earlier, a hushed exchange about land ownership and Sarah's valuable property on the outskirts of town. He had dismissed it at the time, but now, seeing Withers' discomfort, a chilling realization dawned on him. He glanced at Sarah again, noticing how the wind caught her hair, revealing a small birthmark behind her ear, a mark identical to one his own sister possessed. His sister, who had died young from a fever Sarah could have perhaps cured with her knowledge of herbs. He looked back at Withers, who was now subtly trying to signal Reverend Elijah, a barely perceptible nod of his head. The preacher, however, seemed oblivious, lost in his own self-righteous fervor. Jedediah realized that Withers knew something that could prove Sarah's innocence, but he was too afraid to speak out. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The dying cattle, the failing crops, the mysterious illness. It all pointed to a deliberate act of sabotage, a scheme orchestrated by Withers and Reverend Elijah to drive the town into despair and seize control of their land and resources. And Sarah, with her independent spirit and her valuable property, was simply an obstacle to be eliminated. The weight of this revelation hit Jedediah with full force. He could no longer stand idly by and allow this travesty to occur. He had to act, but a very few, showed a flicker of hope in their eyes. "You dare defy the will of the town?" Reverend Elijah thundered, his voice echoing across the square. "You are sworn to uphold the law. The law is supposed to be about justice," Jedediah retorted, his voice gaining strength. "And there is no justice here. This woman is innocent." "Innocent," Reverend Elijah scoffed. "She is a witch. She has cursed this town." "No," Jedediah said, his voice firm. "She has been accused by men who seek to profit from our suffering, men who have poisoned our land and our minds." He turned to face the crowd, his gaze sweeping across their faces. "Look at old man Withers," he said, pointing a finger at the banker. "See the guilt in his eyes. He knows the truth. He knows that he and Reverend Elijah have been plotting to steal our land, to drive us out of our homes." Withers recoiled, his face turning ashen. Reverend Elijah stepped forward, his eyes blazing with anger. "He is lying," he shouted. "He is trying to protect this witch." "I'm not lying," Jedediah said, his voice ringing with conviction. "I have seen the evidence. I have heard the truth, and I will not be a part of this injustice." He reached out and grabbed the rope, severing it with a sharp knife. The noose fell to the ground, a symbol of the tyranny he had just defied. The crowd erupted in chaos, their anger and fear threatening to spill over into violence. Jedediah stood his ground, ready to face the consequences of his actions. He knew that it had just ignited a firestorm, but he also knew that he had done the right thing. He had chosen justice over duty, truth over fear, and he was prepared to defend his choice, no matter the cost. The crowd surged forward, a wave of angry faces and clenched fists. Reverend Elijah, his eyes blazing with fury, pointed at Jedediah. "Seize him," he bellowed. "He is a traitor. He is in league with the witch." Several men stepped forward, their intentions clear. Jedediah stood his ground, his hand resting on the handle of his revolver. He didn't want to resort to violence, but he was prepared to defend himself and Sarah. "Stay back," he warned, his voice calm but firm. "I don't want to hurt anyone, but I will if I have to." Sarah, still standing on the gallows, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of fear and gratitude. She had never expected anyone to stand up for her, to risk their own life to save her. She saw the determination in Jedediah's eyes, the unwavering conviction that he was doing the right thing. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the back of the crowd. "He's telling the truth." It was Doc Miller, the town's physician, a man respected for his intelligence and his unwavering commitment to truth. He pushed his way through the crowd, his face grim. "I've been suspicious of Reverend Elijah for some time," Doc Miller said, his voice carrying across the square. "He's been hoarding supplies, spreading rumors, and manipulating the town for his own gain. And I've seen old man Withers sneaking around, tampering with the water supply." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd. Doc Miller's words carried weight, and some people began to question their own judgment. "He's lying," Reverend Elijah shouted, his voice shrill with desperation. "He's trying to undermine my authority." "No," Doc Miller said, his voice firm. "I'm trying to save this town from a charlatan and a thief." He turned to face the crowd. "Think about it," he said. "Has Reverend Elijah done anything to help us? Or has he only sown division and fear? Has old man Withers offered us any relief from our financial troubles? Or has he only tightened his grip on our wallets?" His words struck a chord with some of the townsfolk. They began to look at Reverend Elijah and old man Withers with newfound suspicion. The tide was beginning to turn. The square became a battleground of words and emotions. Some townsfolk, still loyal to Reverend Elijah, shouted accusations and threats at Jedediah and Doc Miller. Others, swayed by Doc Miller's revelations, began to murmur amongst themselves, their faces etched with doubt and confusion. "He's right," a farmer named Thomas called out. "My crops have been failing ever since Reverend Elijah came to town. And Old Man Withers has been threatening to foreclose on my farm." "Mine too," another voice shouted. "He said I'd be better off selling my land to him." The accusations began to pile up, each one further eroding Reverend Elijah's authority and bolstering Jedediah's case. The tide was turning, but the situation remained volatile. The townsfolk were divided, their loyalties torn between their faith in Reverend Elijah and their growing suspicion that they had been manipulated. Reverend Elijah, realizing that he was losing control, tried to regain the upper hand. "These are lies," he shouted, his voice hoarse with desperation. "They're trying to deceive you. They're trying to lead you astray." He pointed at Sarah, still standing on the gallows. "She is the source of all our troubles. She is a witch. We must cast her out." But his words no longer carried the same weight. The townsfolk were no longer willing to blindly accept his pronouncements. They had begun to think for themselves, to question the narrative that he had so carefully constructed. The situation reached a fever pitch. Some townsfolk drew their weapons, ready to fight for their beliefs. Others tried to mediate, urging calm and reason. The square was a chaotic mix of anger, fear, and uncertainty. Jedediah knew that he had to act quickly to prevent the situation from spiraling out of control. He stepped forward, raising his hands to silence the crowd. "Enough," he shouted, his voice booming across the square. "We cannot let fear and anger divide us. We must find the truth, and we must do it together." He looked at Sarah, her eyes filled with hope and gratitude. He knew that her fate and the fate of the town rested on his shoulders. He had to find a way to unite the townsfolk, to expose the truth, and to bring justice to Dust Gulch. But how? Jedediah, with his imposing frame and unwavering gaze, stood as a bulwark between Sarah and the enraged faction of the townsfolk. He knew that any sudden movement, any sign of weakness, could trigger a full-blown riot. He had to maintain control, to buy time for reason to prevail. "I am the law in this town," he declared, his voice resonating with authority, "and I will not allow violence to be done here today. Sarah is under my protection, and anyone who tries to harm her will have to answer to me." He knew that his words wouldn't sway everyone, but he hoped to deter those who were on the fence, those who were still wrestling with their consciences. He also knew that he had to find a way to defuse the situation, to prevent the violence from escalating. He remembered a passage from the town charter, a little-known clause that stipulated that any accusation of witchcraft had to be supported by irrefutable evidence, evidence that was clearly lacking in Sarah's case. According to the town charter, he announced, any accusation of witchcraft must be supported by concrete evidence, not just rumors and hearsay. And in this case, there is no evidence, only suspicion and prejudice. He challenged the townsfolk to produce any real evidence against Sarah, knowing that they couldn't. He used his knowledge of the law to undermine their accusations, to expose the flimsy foundation upon which their judgment was based. Meanwhile, Doc Miller continued to rally support for Sarah, speaking to individual townsfolk, sharing his suspicions about Reverend Elijah and Old Man Withers, and urging them to think for themselves. Slowly but surely, the tide was turning. More and more townsfolk began to question the narrative that had been fed to them, to see Sarah not as a witch, but as a victim of manipulation and greed. The standoff continued, tense and precarious. Jedediah knew that the situation could change at any moment, that a single spark could ignite the powder keg. But he also knew that he couldn't give up, that he had to continue to stand his ground, to protect Sarah and to fight for justice. The future of Dust Gulch hung in the balance. Just as the tension seemed about to snap, a group of townsfolk, led by the pragmatic blacksmith, Silas, stepped forward, placing themselves between Jedediah and the still hostile faction. Silas was a man of few words, but his honesty and strength were respected throughout Dust Gulch. "Enough is enough," Silas declared, his voice ringing with authority. "We've been played for fools. Reverend Elijah and Old Man Withers have been lining their own pockets while we've been suffering." He gestured to the group behind him, a diverse collection of farmers, ranchers, and merchants. "We've seen the evidence," he said. "We've heard the accusations, and we believe that Sarah is innocent." The arrival of Silas and his supporters shifted the balance of power. The townsfolk who had been wavering now had a clear choice to make: side with Reverend Elijah and Old Man Withers, or join Jedediah and Silas in the fight for justice. "We demand a fair trial," Silas continued, "a trial where evidence is presented and witnesses are allowed to speak freely. And until then, Sarah will remain under our protection." The crowd erupted in a fresh wave of arguments and accusations. But this time, the voices of reason were louder, more confident. The townsfolk were beginning to see through the lies and manipulations of Reverend Elijah and Old Man Withers. Reverend Elijah, realizing that he was losing his grip on the town, made a desperate move. He pulled out a pistol and aimed it at Sarah. "If I can't have her," he screamed, his face contorted with rage, "then no one will." Before anyone could react, Jedediah lunged forward, knocking the pistol from Reverend Elijah's hand. The gun clattered to the ground, and the crowd gasped in horror. The moment of crisis had arrived. The fate of Sarah and the future of Dust Gulch hung in the balance. Would the townsfolk succumb to fear and violence? Or would they choose justice and reason? The answer was about to be revealed. As Jedediah wrestled with Reverend Elijah, a sudden tremor shook the ground. The sky, which had been a clear, unforgiving blue, turned an ominous shade of gray. A low rumble echoed through the mountains, growing louder with each passing second. The townsfolk, momentarily forgetting their animosity, looked up in fear and confusion. They had never experienced anything like this before. Sarah, still standing on the gallows, her eyes wide with apprehension, recognized the signs. "It's a flash flood," she cried out, her voice filled with urgency. "The dam upstream has broken. We need to get to higher ground." Her words were met with disbelief and skepticism. Some townsfolk dismissed her warning as another attempt to deceive them. But others, remembering her knowledge of the natural world, began to take her seriously. As if to confirm her warning, a wall of water came crashing down the canyon, sweeping away everything in its path. The townsfolk screamed in terror, scrambling to escape the onrushing flood. Jedediah, realizing the imminent danger, grabbed Sarah and pulled her off the gallows. Together, they raced towards the highest point in town, urging the others to follow them. The floodwaters surged through Dust Gulch, inundating buildings, destroying property, and threatening lives. But thanks to Sarah's timely warning, most of the townsfolk managed to reach safety. As the floodwaters receded, the townsfolk emerged from their shelters, shaken but alive. They looked around at the devastation, their faces etched with shock and gratitude. They realized that Sarah, the woman they had accused of witchcraft, had actually saved their lives. Her knowledge of the natural world, her ability to recognize the signs of impending disaster, had been the only thing that stood between them and certain death. The remaining doubters finally understood the truth. Sarah was not a witch. She was a healer, a protector, a valuable member of their community. Their fear and prejudice had blinded them to her true nature. The flood had washed away more than just buildings and belongings. It had washed away the town's collective delusion. Seeing Sarah's selfless act, the townspeople finally recognized the extent of Reverend Elijah's manipulation. The tide had irrevocably turned. "He knew about the dam," someone shouted, pointing at Reverend Elijah, who was now trying to slip away unnoticed. "He knew it was unstable, and he did nothing to warn us." Others chimed in, recounting instances where Reverend Elijah had profited from their misfortunes, buying up land at discounted prices, hoarding supplies, and spreading fear and division to maintain his control. "He's a charlatan," a woman cried out. "He used our faith to line his own pockets." The crowd surged towards Reverend Elijah, their anger and resentment boiling over. Jedediah stepped in, preventing them from resorting to violence. but he didn't stop them from confronting the preacher with their accusations. "We trusted you," Silas shouted, his voice filled with disappointment. "We believed in you, and you betrayed us." Reverend Elijah, cornered and exposed, could no longer maintain his facade of righteousness. He confessed to his schemes, admitting that he had deliberately withheld information about the dam, hoping to drive the town to ruin and seize control of their land. Old Man Withers, seeing that the game was up, also confessed to his role in the conspiracy, revealing that he had been secretly diverting water from the town's irrigation system, exacerbating the drought and forcing farmers to sell their land at rock-bottom prices. The townsfolk, their hearts filled with anger and betrayal, turned against Reverend Elijah and Old Man Withers, stripping them of their positions of authority and demanding that they be held accountable for their crimes. Justice, which had been so elusive, had finally arrived in Dust Gulch. The charade was over. The town had chosen truth over fear, reason over superstition. And in doing so, they had saved themselves. With Reverend Elijah and Old Man Withers brought to justice, the townspeople turned their attention to Sarah, their faces filled with remorse and gratitude. They released her from her shackles, declaring her innocence and begging for her forgiveness. "We were wrong, Sarah," a townsman said, his voice choked with emotion. "We let fear cloud our judgment. We are sorry." Sarah, her heart filled with compassion, forgave them without hesitation. She understood that they had been manipulated and that their actions were born out of desperation and fear. "It's over now," she said, her voice gentle. "We can learn from this. We can build a better future, a future based on trust and understanding." The townspeople then turned to Jedediah, their faces filled with admiration and respect. They had initially seen him as a symbol of death and oppression, but he had proven himself to be a man of courage and integrity. "You saved us, Jedediah," Silas said, extending his hand. "You stood up for what was right, even when it meant risking everything." Jedediah, humbled by their praise, shook Silas's hand. He had never sought their approval, but it felt good to be recognized for his actions, to be seen as something other than a hangman. The townspeople hailed him as a hero, a symbol of justice and courage. They offered him positions of power and influence, urging him to lead them into a new era of prosperity and enlightenment. Jedediah, however, declined their offers. He had no desire for power or recognition. He simply wanted to live a quiet life, to use his skills and knowledge to help others, and to ensure that justice was served in Dust Gulch. He was now a beacon of hope. In the aftermath of the flood and the exposure of Reverend Elijah and Old Man Withers, Dust Gulch lay in ruins, both physically and emotionally. The townspeople were traumatized, their trust shattered, their homes and businesses destroyed. Sarah and Jedediah, having formed a deep bond during the ordeal, knew that they couldn't simply walk away. They felt a responsibility to help the town rebuild, to heal the wounds, and to create a better future for Dust Gulch. "We can't leave them now," Sarah said to Jedediah, her eyes filled with determination. "They need our help. We can show them that even after everything that's happened, there's still hope." Jedediah nodded in agreement. "You're right," he said. "This is our home. We can't let fear and prejudice destroy it." Together, they decided to stay in Dust Gulch and dedicate themselves to rebuilding the community. Sarah used her knowledge of herbs and healing to tend to the sick and injured, providing comfort and care to those who had lost everything. Jedediah, with his strength and his sense of justice, helped to restore order and rebuild the town's infrastructure. They also worked to foster understanding and dispel superstition, teaching the townspeople about the importance of reason, compassion, and respect for others. They organized town meetings where people could share their stories, express their fears, and work together to find solutions to their problems. Slowly but surely, Dust Gulch began to heal. The townspeople, inspired by Sarah and Jedediah's example, started to rebuild their lives, their homes, and their community. They learned to trust each other again, to embrace diversity, and to reject the fear and prejudice that had almost destroyed them. Dust Gulch was being reborn. Years passed, and Dust Gulch slowly but surely transformed. The scars of the flood remained, a constant reminder of the town's near destruction, but they also served as a symbol of resilience and renewal. The townspeople, inspired by Sarah and Jedediah's leadership, embraced a new era of tolerance and enlightenment. They rebuilt their homes and businesses stronger and more resilient than before. They established a school where children learned about science, history, and the importance of critical thinking. They welcomed newcomers with open arms, creating a diverse and vibrant community. Sarah continued to practice her healing arts, sharing her knowledge of herbs and natural remedies with anyone who sought her help. She became a beloved figure in Dust Gulch, revered for her wisdom, her compassion, and her unwavering commitment to the well-being of others. Jedediah, though he never sought the limelight, became a respected leader in the town. He used his knowledge of the law and his sense of justice to ensure that everyone was treated fairly and that the mistakes of the past were never repeated. The story of Sarah and Jedediah became a legend in Dust Gulch, a tale told and retold around campfires and in saloons, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope can prevail, and that even the most hardened heart can be touched by compassion and courage. Dust Gulch was no longer a town defined by fear and superstition. It was a town defined by tolerance, understanding, and an unwavering commitment to justice. And it was all thanks to the courage of a hangman who dared to defy a mob and the wisdom of a woman who was wrongly accused of witchcraft. Their legacy lived on, a beacon of hope in the heart of the Wild West. The end.